So just as kind of review, right? We're trying to understand why it was that the capitalist liberal democracies won the Cold War. And it's important to also stress, I was trying to argue this is going to be kind of like a war of society versus society. Whichever society is best at giving its people happiness, typically measured by freedom and economic prosperity, that system in the long run will win out. And so key point was keeping faith in the system. Now, and we also mentioned how in the 1960s in the United States, there was a lot of challenges to the system. For many people, the system wasn't working. And we looked at the issue of African-American civil rights and discrimination against African-Americans as an area where the capitalist liberal democratic promises of freedom and economic prosperity were being denied to African-Americans. And we showed, though, how democracy allowed, within the context of the Cold War, for a positive change, right? African Americans and their allies were able to obtain the recognition and the enforcement of African American civil rights within the system. So you could have change when you had problems while still maintaining a capitalist liberal democratic system. We didn't have to overthrow the system in order to bring these changes. And what that meant was Americans, even if they had problems and were not 100% satisfied with the way things were in our country, they kept faith that democracy could eventually help them overcome those issues. And again, to give you, like I said, this concrete example, African Americans are able to obtain their civil rights and have those civil rights respected, and that leads to greater economic prosperity for African Americans and to really be included in that American dream of freedom and economic prosperity. And so that will make them more willing to support the system. Right? The system can change. It can bring positive good. So we're going to stick with the system rather than trying to change to something else. Now, the communists are going to also face problems, but as we shall see, their system, rather than being able to solve those problems, at least in the European communism, will fail to solve those problems and will actually basically implode. Right? They will not be able to solve those problems. So what were these problems? Well, first of all, one thing we have to emphasize is that the communist countries, the Soviet Union, and the countries that it will force to accept communist governments, such as Poland, Romania, and Hungary, were generally economically behind the capitalist liberal democracies. So even before World War II, those countries were behind the capitalist liberal democracies. Right? They were not as advanced as those capitalist liberal democracies. So they're already starting off kind of behind. In addition, remember, the Soviet Union lost 20 million people, and the Nazis were able to occupy a good portion of their country. Hungary, Romania, Poland, all these other countries too suffered from Nazi invasion as well. So not only were they economically behind the capitalist liberal democracies, and they were even pushed, in a sense, further behind, relatively speaking, by the devastation of World War II. Right? The British and the French also suffered during World War II. But not as much as the Soviet Union and some of these other countries. So one thing we have to emphasize, the one problem the communists have, is that from the very beginning, they're behind. So from the capitalist liberal democrat perspective, they just need to maintain their lead. But from the communist perspective, they have to catch up and then get ahead. And that's much more difficult to do. However, the communist theorists were confident, were quite hopeful that this could be done. And they basically made some promises, right? They made some promises. The communist leaders told their people, for now, you need to sacrifice your freedom in order to focus on economic development, right? If we're going to catch up with and then surpass the capitalist countries, we need to be disciplined, right? You need to trust your government, do what the government tells you to do, and eventually, because our economy is going to be more efficient, because you're doing what you're told to do, we're going to catch up. And even though the capitalists are ahead for now, don't worry. They're going to start getting, they're going to slow down. They're going to have more problems. The contradictions in the capitalist system will lead to problems there. For example, their promise that they're just going to keep getting wealthier and wealthier. We know that's not going to happen. And also, they're not going to distribute goods equally. So we know that there's going to be conflict and problems. And of course, the Soviet Union knew what was going on in capitalist liberal democracies, that there were protests, that there were economic problems, that there were struggles and conflict. We just talked about the civil rights movement and how the Soviet Union was aware of that. And they were confident that the capitalist liberal democratic system could not handle those problems. As we see, they did, right? But at first, it looked like that the capitalist liberal democracies would not be able to deal with these problems, and eventually they would have political chaos, and they would fall behind in economic development, and the communist countries would go ahead. And because the communist system is correct from the perspective of these theorists, we will eventually generate more wealth than the capitalists, and that wealth will be equally distributed, right? So we just need to work hard for now. We'll catch up, and we'll surpass them. And it won't be that hard because eventually their societies are going to fall apart because of the economic inequalities. And it's kind of easy to think that way, especially in the 1960s when you're looking at what's going on in the capitalist liberal democracies. And here's the thing. Once we defeat the capitalists, once we've achieved victory over the capitalists, we'll be economically ahead of them. We will distribute that stuff equally, and then you can have freedom. And in fact, because we're not going to have this inherently bad capitalist system, you will have even more freedom than the capitalists had. You will have that perfect freedom and the material goods to enjoy it that communism promises, right? So I want to stress, this is not irrational. This is reasonable at first, at least. If you're a communist in the late 1940s, in the 1950s, and even into the 1960s, this is pretty easy to believe. It seems rational, right? We know there's all these problems going on in the capitalist liberal democracies. We know that our economy is developing in many ways. It's easy to believe this. However, once we get into the 70s and 80s, as the capitalist liberal democracies have successfully dealt with their problems in many respects, I'm not saying there's no problems, but it's hard to think that there's going to be, relatively easy to think that there might be a revolution in 1960s America, but not 1970s and certainly not the 1980s, right? So this is reasonable at first, but eventually a lot of communists start saying, you know what, we don't think this system's really going to work that well. We're falling behind, right? So they're going to have a fundamental crisis of hope in their system, right? They're never going to get, in a sense, out of step one, right? Communists will sacrifice their freedom for now in order to focus on economic development, but darn it, that economic development never seems to let them catch up to the capitalists. Right? And the capitalists will leave them far behind. And what happened is, and this is why I'm kind of critical when the Soviet Union claimed not to be imperialist, was when countries tried to change their system, the Soviet Union would invade. So for example, Hungary in the 1950s will attempt to change its system and get rid of communism. It was forced to accept a communist government, and the Soviet Union will roll in tanks to force the Hungarians to go back to being communists. And that's a sign there on that picture that says Russians get out in Hungarian. Czechoslovakia will try and do the same thing. The Soviet Union will also send in tanks, right? So there is a kind of problem here, right? There's a serious problem. So in order to understand why, and I'm going to really oversimplify things, but it does give us a general idea of why people will lose faith in the communist system, at least in the Soviet Union and in Europe, we need to understand the economy. And we need to go back to this idea of a command economy, right? I talked a little bit about this earlier under Stalin, but remember how Stalin had those 5-year plans and a centralized economy where the government planned what you should do. So in a command economy, just as review, the government will tell people what to produce, how to produce it, and for whom to produce it, right? And ideally, this never works 100%, but ideally this is completely determined and controlled by the central authority of the government. And the Soviet Union did in many respects control production in this way. Like I said, they don't get up to 100%, but they do get very far along. So we need to talk a little bit more about these centralized economies if we want to understand why it was that communism in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe is going to fall. So first of all, we have to recognize there are positives about the command economy, right? As we saw with Joseph Stalin, even though he used cruel and I would argue evil means in order to develop the industrial base of the Soviet Union, the fact is it worked. Imperial Russia was not able to stand up to Germany in World War I and fell out of the war. However, the Soviet Union was able to stand up to Germany in World War II. So this industrialization did in fact work. So, and there were other countries, in fact, that would adopt these kind of centralized economies and actually adopt the 5-year plans that would be used in the Soviet Union. So, in fact, if your economy is weak and relatively not industrialized, then centralized planning can be quite good, right? It can really help you to industrialize quickly, which is what we saw in the Soviet Union. It is also good at building up a powerful military. The Soviet Union, even though it was not as wealthy as the United States, still had a military that was very strong. And centralized economies can actually, if they're run well, can do a pretty good job of seeing to the basic needs of human beings. In the Soviet Union, you were likely to live in a crowded apartment, but you had an apartment. You didn't have to live in a house, a hut with a thatched roof. You may have to share. You may not have as much space as others, but you still had basic housing. You may not have the best food in the world if you're a member of a communist country, but you weren't starving. And we have to stress that was, in many places where communism was established, was an improvement. So communism, using decentralized planning, did become good at building up a powerful military and seeing to the basic needs of the people and carrying out a lot of industrialization. This works, though, only to a point. As economies become more complex, centralized governments do not do a good job of allocating resources efficiently. Right? Centralized economies, when a country gets extraordinarily complex, just do not work all that efficiently. I mean, and you can kind of think about it this way. Which do you think works better to make clothes that people may like? Just having government bureaucrats design clothing, or allowing fashion designers to design clothing, and then based on sales, either those fashion designers prosper or they go out of business, right? If you are wanting, and I think that's a way to kind of think about this, right? As the economy becomes more complex, when people start saying, okay, I've got basic clothing, but I would like to dress up every now and then, or I want to go out on a date and I want to look nice, right? How do you deal with those needs, right? Once people get to their above a basic subsistence level, we would like nice things, right? So as the economy becomes more complex, it becomes difficult for government bureaucrats to even understand this. So if you're a government bureaucrat, you're like, who cares about fashionable clothing? I want more tanks, or I want rocket ships. And I'm not kidding. There were actually like these centralized government figures who would figure out like, oh, if we allow nightclubs and let people go dancing, this is how much energy it wastes. So we shouldn't have these things, right? These are decadent. But of course, that just ignores how human beings are. We like to have fun. We like to have a good time. And so the Soviet Union and other communist countries in this time period, they did make survivability increase. They did make sure that people would get their basic necessities, but they weren't good at letting people have fun, right? They saw those as a waste. So in particular then, as these centralized economies were very poor at producing adequate, high-quality consumer goods, right? In fact, they produced very few high-quality consumer goods. They produced more poor-quality consumer goods, but there was never enough, right? So you can kind of think about it this way. They were able to give you what you needed to survive, these communist centralized economies, but they couldn't give you much more than that. And this led to serious economic problems that really impacted people's lives. There were massive shortages a lot of the time. The government chose to emphasize, like I said, military spending. So that meant people at times were not able to get enough shoes or enough clothing. They would have basic stuff, but they may have to wear the same pair of shoes for a long time or something like that, and need new ones. And you can kind of get a sense of that this led to things like lines, right? That's a picture of women waiting to buy shoes, and you can see they're dressed, right? They're dressed for the cold. They're not what we would say, it's not like, oh, these people are impoverished and starving. They're clearly not. They had their basic needs met, but they're waiting in line just to buy shoes, right? You can't just walk in and choose your shoes here and then go to the cashier and buy them. The shoes are rationed. Only certain people are able to get shoes every so often, and you have to wait in line in order to get those shoes. So you may spend hours waiting in line just to get your pair of shoes as you go through the government bureaucracy, hand over your ration, stamps, and so forth. And there was a saying sometimes in communist countries, a family is blessed that has grandparents because they don't have to work and they can go sit and wait in line for you. And people, the elderly would, get up at 4 a.m. and go down to the store and get in line so they could get their food. So, you have a problem, right? when you have to wait in line for long periods of time just to get basic quality items. And remember, it's not like they had phones or anything to play with while they were in line. It could be quite boring. And of course, this would also increase corruption, right? Oh, you want shoes? You don't want to wait in line? Well, I run the shoe store. And if you pay me some money or give me something from the factory you run, I'll make sure you get the shoes, right? And I'm certainly going to make sure my family gets the shoes first. So the problem is basically you have this inefficient, centralized economy, which while making sure that it can meet basic human needs, doesn't make is not able to meet human wants, right? And like I said, it has these negative problems, such as shortages, lines, and the inevitable corruption that rises out of that. I think to make things a little bit more clear, I need to give you some examples. So, for example, this on the left is a communist piece of propaganda. I believe it's a poster. And it's kind of strange, right? I mean, you've got this, I don't know if I should say a person, but a human-like shape in the shape of these clothes, holding out clothes and pulling something out from beneath the jacket there. And what this represents is a kind of black marketeer, right? This is someone who sells things that are forbidden things from the West, decadent things from the West. And that's what the person's holding out, is all these fine items that exist in the West, but you really shouldn't have. They're a waste. They're bourgeoisie. They're anti-communist. And you should not be buying things from such people. These people are bad who are selling these items that people want. So there's a problem right there, in a sense, is that you've got these kind of capitalists in the Soviet Union who are selling things to people because that those people want. And from our perspective, this stuff looks rather harmless, right? I mean, it's socks, a sport coat, nice shirts, some crazy ties, but this is seen as bad, right? And I think it's interesting that they've got the girl in I guess in a swimsuit, and it says "Made in the USA," and the idea is, the U.S. is this source of decadence. But the thing also, please note, is that the figure is wearing jeans. It was illegal to purchase and wear jeans in the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc countries. They were considered a sign of imperialism. So people it was illegal to buy jeans. You could be punished for buying jeans. Police were assigned to police what were called jeans crimes. And so I think that gives you kind of a concrete example of what I mean here. That this system, while it's capable of taking care of basic needs, it sees, not only is it not able to supply its people with jeans or other nice fashionable clothing items that they would like, it sees those things as dangerous and tries to punish its citizens for purchasing them. Now, it's not like they would shoot you if you bought jeans, but you could be punished for this, right? And one thing I think is striking, and this letter is written just before the fall of the Soviet Union, when jeans were finally allowed, right? So this is a letter from a school teacher in the Soviet Union. I'm going to read it to you in case you can't read it. She's, English is her second, perhaps third language. So there's a few grammar issues, but her meaning is clear, and that's what is important. But she writes, and she's writing to an American jeans company, right? So this is a woman, Soviet Union woman, writing to Levi Jeans Company just before the fall of the Soviet Union. And she writes, "Dear friends, the Soviet teacher Larissa is writing to you, period. A man hasn't very much happy minutes in his life, but every happy moment remains in his memory for a long time. I'm not the fanatic of clothes, but the buying of Levi's jeans 501 is one of such moments in my life," right? So this Soviet teacher is writing that one of their happiest moments in their life is when they got to buy jeans. And they stress, it's not like I'm I'm not crazy about fashion, but this was so important to me. I'm 24. But while wearing your jeans, I feel myself like a 15 years old schoolgirl, right? I feel myself like a graceful, slender, and beautiful girl, right? So think about this, right? This is how happy that this woman has been denied for many years, right? She finally has the right in the Soviet Union under some reforms to buy jeans, and she is so happy just to have a pair of jeans. And these jeans make her feel beautiful, right? And in a sense, this shows the problem, the kind of sadness that existed in the Soviet culture, right? I mean, I feel bad for this woman, right? She had so many troubles and so lived in such a culture that rejected anything nice in life, in a sense, that she's so wonderfully happy just to have jeans. And she continues, "Thank you very much for such comfortable, soft, light, and nice jeans. Good luck to your kind and necessary business," right? So, and it's signed then your Russian purchaser from the USSR, Larisa Popnik. And this is really striking, right? Again, this shows the problems in this system, right? This fascinating letter, I think, shows the problems in this system. And so this woman, a Russian living in the Soviet Union, which is is still currently communist, just admires this capitalist country and how it's able, in this capitalist business, and how it's able to produce what people would like. So by the 1980s, many people in the communist world said, you know what? We need change. We need reform. We need to fix this system. It's clear that our economy is not working. It's clear that it's, instead of pulling ahead of the Americans and the British and the French, we're falling further behind, right? We're falling further behind, right? Remember, there's this competition. Who can make its citizens most happy, chiefly through giving political freedom and economic prosperity. And we're losing, and we're falling further behind. So Gorbachev is going to attempt to reform to catch up with the West. Now, he's going to do something very dangerous because he's going to engage in political and economic reform at the same time. He's going to allow people in the Soviet Union to have more freedom, like our friend Larissa, right? She's going to get more freedom and is going to be able to do things like write a letter like this, which I don't believe would have been allowed in the Soviet Union in the past, right? She writes a letter and says it to an American company praising them. That sort of thing was not allowed previously. And they're also going to allow the economic reform that allows her to buy those jeans. So the Soviet Union says, okay, fine, we've got to change. We need to reform. We're going to engage in this reform at the same time. So they try and bring political and economic reform at the same time. And the problem is, this leads the system to implode. People like Larissa will basically say, well, why do we want to reform communism? Why don't we just be like the West in the United States and Britain and France and in West Germany, in Japan? All these countries have become really wealthy and happy, or at least relatively happy. Hey, we have genes, right? Relatively happy by following capitalist liberal democracy. Why shouldn't we just be like them? Right? Why should we try and save this dying system? Let's let it go. And that's just what happens. Between 1989 and 1991, Eastern European communist countries and the Soviet republics. The Soviet Union is made up of multiple countries, including Russia, but not only Russia, will all become independent. Once they have the freedom to choose the system that they want, none of them will choose communism, right? So Poland, Hungary, Romania, there's the more than a dozen republics that make up the Soviet Union, all of which were communists. After 1991, not a single one will be communist. And the Soviet Union then will fall, right? The Soviet Union will fall apart, and that is the end of it. And I just want to point out, I just think it's striking, right? I was born in 1978, so I grew up during this time period, and I cannot adequately express how frightened we were of the Soviet Union and communism. And then, there were movies at the time talking about, like, what would happen to us if the Soviet Union invaded. And I thought it might happen. We now know that was impossible. It wouldn't have happened. But there was still fear of war. And it was amazing that the Soviet Union fell without, in a sense, any war. And it was striking to myself and to many Americans who lived in this time period. And we felt such confidence. We said, our system is really awesome. We defeated the evil empire, which is what President Ronald Reagan called it, and which I think many Americans refer to it as such, without even firing a shot, right? Just because our system was working that much better.